So after Prabhupada departed in ISKCON, there was a big controversy. Who will the new disciples belong to? Will they belong to Prabhupada? Will they be disciples of Prabhupada? Or will they be the disciples of, say, for example, the leaders of ISKCON, the governing body commission people, or the so-called Ritviks that Prabhupada had appointed? He appointed people to initiate on his behalf, which is on the July 9th letter that he signed in 1977, that he was appointing Ritviks. So who would these disciples be the property of? Would they be the property of Prabhupada, or these 11 people, or would they be the property of ISKCON, in which case they would really be the property of Prabhupada? This became a big dispute. But it's just like everything else in ISKCON. Who is going to be offered the bhoga? The unoffered food is offered to the pure devotee. So again, same issue came up. Who gets offered the bhoga? Should we offer it to Prabhupada, or should we offer it to these 11 people who were supposedly appointed as his successors because they were Ritviks while he was here? Who gets offered the bhoga? So the disciples, all of a sudden, were no longer going to be the property of Prabhupada. They were going to be the property of these 11 men. And the offering of food was going to be made to these 11 men. It was no longer going to be offered to Prabhupada. And what about the money? And what about the property? When Prabhupada was here, the money was offered to him. It was offered to his ISKCON society. And all of a sudden, the 11 so-called Ritviks, who had become the so-called appointed successors, they started to claim that the money and the property was theirs. Jayatirtha even made a direct statement: it's my money, it's my men, it's my buildings, and I can do what I want. So there was this idea that the money was no longer belonging to Prabhupada, the new disciples were no longer going to belong to Prabhupada, the food was no longer going to be offered to Prabhupada, and someone else was going to be the proprietor of all these benefits. Someone else was going to be owning the disciples other than Prabhupada. And there was also a lot of fighting amongst the so-called successors, because people from one zone would go to live in another guru zone, and then they didn't want to really worship that particular guru who was there. They didn't like him for some reason. And so there was a lot of conflicts going on. And there was another problem where disciples of a particular one of these successors would go to another zone, and he would recruit for his guru within the zone of another guru, and this would create a conflict, and there was always some kind of war going on amongst these 11 over who's going to be the proprietor, who's going to be the owner of these disciples, who's going to be the owner of the buildings, the property, the money, and so on. So really, Prabhupada was no longer going to be the owner. That was really the bottom line. Prabhupada was no longer considered to be the proprietor of the disciples, the new disciples. He was not the proprietor of the buildings, because the gurus put themselves and their, let's say, dedicated new people as the signers on the properties. So in this way, they sort of forced the properties into being their private, controlled, properties. So this was breaking down the unity of ISKCON simultaneously, because now you had really 11 different groups of people who were getting their own disciples and their own money and their own buildings and their own program, and the food was offered to that particular so-called guru who was in that particular zone, and it wasn't being offered to anyone else. Now, what has happened after all this sort of unraveled and these 11 started to fall down and have all kinds of problems, and it became evident that they were not gurus and they were not qualified to take disciples, they were not qualified to take all the money and the assets of ISKCON, and they were not qualified to have the food being offered to them, because the food has to be offered to a pure devotee. Neither they were qualified to take the sins of all these new people. They were initiating people, claiming that they were Diksha Gurus, which means they were taking these sins, just like Jesus takes the sins of his followers. So they were claiming, yes, we're just like Jesus. We are taking the sins of our followers. Then, of course, some of them got sick, and some of them died, and some of them fell down, and there was a lot of problems. And so the followers began to say that the reason these gurus are falling down and getting sick and dying from getting too sick is that they've absorbed too many sins. They took all of our sins, and so now they're suffering a reaction. But no one really asked the question, who authorized them to take these sins? When were they authorized to claim that they were equal to Jesus and they could absorb sins? No one ever gave them the authority to do that. It was just assumed that they had that potency. They had the potency to absorb the sins of other people. But you can't just assume that you're Jesus. Oh, you're another Jesus. That's not really how it works. So, but in any case, all kinds of rationalizations began to develop for why gurus fall down and gurus have all these problems. Instead of just saying, well, wait a minute, maybe we should just offer the bhoga to Prabhupada, and maybe the disciples should be Prabhupada's disciples, and maybe the property should be Prabhupada's property, and that's going to solve a lot of these conflicts and a lot of these issues. But it just didn't seem to occur to the leaders that this was the way to fix things. So they came up with all kinds of elaborate rationalizations for how pure devotees fall down, how pure devotees deviate, and so on and so forth. And some of this was aided by Sridhar Maharaj, B.R. Sridhar Maharaj of Navadvip. He helped the GBC develop all kinds of rationalizations. Well, you ask pure devotees, normally they think of Krishna, but sometimes they're an illusion, sometimes they fall down, sometimes they're overcome by sex desire, sometimes they're overcome by desire for intoxication, sometimes this, sometimes that. So the position of pure devotee became watered down quite substantially, to the point where pure devotees are people who have all kinds of mundane conditioning. So this is not working. It just doesn't work. And so what's really happening is that ISKCON is gradually becoming emptied out. People are leaving because they don't really accept the explanation that pure devotees are having all these problems. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's also not what Prabhupada preached. Prabhupada did not preach that pure devotees are having all these problems. Instead, Prabhupada said a pure devotee is never going to fall down. He's eternally with Krishna, and he's going to stick with Krishna no matter what. But anyway, the idea that Prabhupada should be the proprietor has been argued against by a lot of people who say, where is the written evidence? Where is the proof? Where did Prabhupada actually say, I'm going to be the proprietor of the disciples, I'm going to be the proprietor of ISKCON, I'm going to be the proprietor of the money, I'm going to be the proprietor of the buildings, everything's going to belong to me and my society? He didn't say that, supposedly. So this gives a license to anybody who wants to make a claim to Prabhupada's disciples or Prabhupada's property. They can just say, well, it's mine because I don't see a letter authorizing something else. I don't see a letter where Prabhupada said he is going to be the proprietor of the new disciples. He's going to be the proprietor of the buildings. People are going to have to offer food to him. He didn't really say that clearly. And my answer to that is, why would he even have to say that? For example, the gopis. The gopis are worshiping Krishna. Does Krishna have to get up every day and get all the gopis to assemble together? And he has to lecture to them, okay, my dear gopis, I want you to remember one thing. You have to offer everything to me. You have to love me. You have to serve me. Don't forget that. And he writes a letter and hands it to each one of the gopis. So then they know what to do. They know what to do because Krishna has written a specific instruction to them. This is what you have to do. You have to offer everything to me. No, the gopis know that already. They don't need a letter from Krishna telling them that everything belongs to Krishna and everything should be done for Krishna. They don't need that kind of instruction. And the reason is simple. They love Krishna. They love Krishna, so automatically they want to give everything to Krishna. And they want to be with Krishna. And they want, if they have some valuable thing, they want to use that in the service of Krishna. They don't need any extra instruction for that. So it should be assumed that if you're a lover of Prabhupada, you're going to offer the new people to Prabhupada, you're going to offer the money to Prabhupada, you're going to offer the buildings to Prabhupada, and you're going to offer the food. The bhoga offerings are going to be made to Prabhupada. He really shouldn't even have to say anything about that. He shouldn't have to write a letter, I want you to love me. Why does he have to say that? If you love him, you're going to offer everything to him, including the new people, including the bhoga, including the buildings, including the money, including everything. Everything will be offered to Prabhupada without question, out of love for Prabhupada. No letter is required. No written instruction is required. If you love Prabhupada, you're going to know that automatically. And it's the same in a marriage. The husband gives his money to the wife, and gives everything to the wife, and gives everything to the family. No letter is required. You know, we don't have to have a written contract. Yes, you will give such and such amount of money to the wife, and so on and so forth. The husband knows he has to give money to the family and to the wife to take care of the family. So, out of love, there's a reciprocation. It's not a written contract. But we keep finding this argument, where's the written contract? Where did Prabhupada say we have to give everything to him? Well, you know, where's your love then for him? That is the real question. If you love Prabhupada, you wouldn't even have to ask that question. So this is a problem we've had with the followers of the Governing Body Commission leaders of ISKCON, and with the Gaudiya Math people like Sridhar Maharaj, Narayan Maharaj, these kinds of people. They always complain, where's the letter? Where's the specific instruction that we have to offer everything to the pure devotee? I don't see that anywhere. Where's the specific letter where Prabhupada specifically says you offer everything to the pure devotee? Well, he says everywhere in his books you have to offer everything to the pure devotee. Why would we have to need an extra special layer of instruction to know that? This is very baffling to me personally. I can't understand. Why don't people get it? Read any of Prabhupada's books. He says you have to offer everything to Krishna. You have to offer everything to the pure devotee. That means you offer the disciples, the new disciples would be offered to him. The bhoga would be offered to him. The money would be offered to him. The buildings would be offered to him. Everything would be offered to him. There wouldn't be any question about this issue. So this question comes up, very simple reason, there's no love. There's no love for Prabhupada. This issue wouldn't even manifest itself. Just like in a marriage. As soon as the question comes up, well, where's the order to give a certain amount of money? As soon as the husband is ordered by the court that he has to pay money to maintain the wife, well, that means there's no longer a loving relationship. There is no loving relationship. And now it's a written contract deal. The judge says the husband has to pay the wife $1,000 every month for her maintenance because they're getting divorced, because they don't get along, because they hate each other. So why would we have the condition of a court-ordered divorce, that we have to give things to Prabhupada under some kind of order, you know, that has to be made independently? I don't understand the rationalization for that. It shouldn't be required if there's a loving sentiment for Prabhupada. So it's pretty obvious that the loving sentiment just isn't there. It just vaporized away. As soon as Prabhupada left, people started saying, well, we have to offer everything to Jayatirtha. We have to offer the disciples to Jayatirtha. We have to offer the food to Jayatirtha. We have to offer the buildings to Jayatirtha. We have to offer everything to Jayatirtha. Well, what happened to Prabhupada? Where is your love for Prabhupada? Where was your love for Prabhupada the whole time, if you didn't understand this principle? So the first problem after 1977 was that 11 of the leaders of ISKCON declared that they had been appointed as Prabhupada's guru successors. And they claimed that they were pure devotees, they were Prabhupada's equals. They were Vishnupad, Acharyapad, Gurupad, and so on and so forth. So they were the, replicants of Prabhupada. They were his replacements, and they were equal in purity to Prabhupada, and therefore they could take disciples of their own, and they could absorb the sins of their disciples, just like Jesus is absorbing sins, because they were as pure as God, they were as pure as Jesus, they were, sin-absorbing, pure devotional representatives of God. That was the way they were portrayed, and everyone had to worship them in the society. People were putting their big seats into the ISKCON temples, where these 11 individuals were being worshipped as the sum total of the demigods, as the representatives of God, and they had just landed from a big airplane from heaven on earth to take us back to God. So the original disciples of Prabhupada, many of them, or most of them, wanted to continue to worship Prabhupada, and they were not exactly happy with this idea that they were now going to have to promote the worship of these 11 individuals. So there was some complaining and questioning going on from the original disciples of Prabhupada. Were you guys appointed? Where were you appointed? Exactly how did Prabhupada envision this 11 guru process was to go on? What kind of prayers were we supposed to be saying to you? Were you supposed to be exactly equal to Prabhupada, or somewhat lesser than Prabhupada, or how is this all going to work? We're giving you Vyasa-san seats, which means you're equal to Vyasa, which means you're equal to Prabhupada. How are you equal to Prabhupada? So various questions were coming up. And so the first way that the 11 began to deal with that was to just remove the people who were asking questions, especially the persistent questioners. They were branded as renegades. They were branded as people who were opposing Prabhupada's appointment of gurus. And they were given a hard time and basically run out of Dodge on a rail. So that happened to Pradyumna. Pradyumna wrote a letter, and he wasn't even directly challenging the appointment. He just said, you guys might be some kind of gurus, but I don't think you deserve the status of an acharya. Maybe we should give you some type of guru worship, but not on the level that you are expecting, which is that you're expecting the same level of worship as Prabhupada was getting. So he was trying to make some adjustment to the thing, and he wasn't even attacking the root issue, which is, we don't think you were appointed. But even that was too much for the 11, so they branded him as a dissident and kicked him out. Yasodhanandan asked questions, he was driven out, and I was asking questions in England. I was in England, and I said, I would like to see this appointment tape. You guys were appointed as gurus, where's the tape? And I was not allowed to see the tape, and neither was anybody else. So the evidence for this appointment was never really shown to us. We just basically had to trust them that they had been appointed. So this would be like a family of 5,000 people who had the leader of the family die, and then 11 people in the family said, we are the sole heirs to the whole estate of the departed father. And you just have to trust us. We're not going to show you the will where we were appointed as the sole heirs to the property. You just have to trust us that we are the appointed successors. So those of us who didn't trust that, we were troublemakers, and we were removed. But a lot of devotees, most devotees, just went along with it because they were fearful. They were afraid of being removed and afraid of challenging the authority of the gurus and so on and so forth. And a number of people just went along with it thinking, that's right, they were appointed, we have to support that. Like, for example, Satsvarup, he allegedly didn't want to sit in his Vyasa-san right away, and so Brahmananda, who was an old devotee and a reputed devotee and respected devotee, he allegedly told Satsvarup, you have to sit in this seat, you have to take this worship. So various people went along with it and helped the 11 promote it. And unfortunately, most of the devotees went along with it, and only a few people really came out questioning. Some of the people who were doubtful didn't say anything. They just kind of silently went along with it. So it was like a conspiracy of silence on one level. So either people went along with it, or there was a conspiracy of silence, and so the dissenters were smaller in number, and it was easier to pick them off, and make them look like they're the isolated crank problem. And so that's what happened. Those of us who protested were painted as a few disgruntled, isolated fools who didn't want to go along with Prabhupada's plan to appoint 11 successors. But gradually, more and more people began to question and doubt, and so as that happened, they were purged out of the society. So there was a slow but steady purging of the disciples of Prabhupada from ISKCON. Gradually, as time went on, the original disciples of Prabhupada were removed, and they were replaced by the new disciples of the new gurus. And the new disciples of the new gurus were very fanatical about defending the worship of their guru. So if you would go into a temple and you were an original Prabhupada disciple and you said, I don't think these people were appointed, you could get beaten up. So there was like a very aggressive program to defend the worship of these 11 people by the new people who were gradually turning ISKCON into 11 very fanatical cults, personality cults, that you had to worship these 11, or you were out, or you were an offender, or you were, a blasphemer, and so on and so forth. So the very heavy process was used to purge out the disciples of Prabhupada. And this obviously was something they all agreed upon. Bhagavan was kicking out many Prabhupada disciples. Hare Krishna was kicking out Prabhupada disciples. Hansaduta kicked out almost all of the Prabhupada disciples from Berkeley. There was only like 2 left in 1984. So he kicked all of them out. Rameshwar was kicking people out. So they obviously had some meeting where they planned this out. They were going to kick out the Prabhupada disciples and replace the Prabhupada disciples with their own disciples, and then they would take control of ISKCON and the properties of ISKCON and so on, especially by putting their own disciples as signers on the properties. They removed the original Prabhupada disciples as signers and put their own disciples on as the signers. So in this way, they took over the assets and properties of ISKCON. Now, one of the people who was helping the GBC with their idea that acharyas are deviants was B.R. Sridhar Maharaj of Navadvip. He became the GBC's topmost advisor, consultant, Shiksha Guru. They said he's the senior most Vaishnava on the planet. Everybody has to listen to him. And Sridhar Maharaj says, yes, acharyas fall down. Acharyas go mad after money, women, followers, intoxication. What's the problem? So that's what they told me. They says, well, Sridhar Maharaj is with us, and Sridhar Maharaj says acharyas fall down, acharyas deviate, and you have to accept that, and no one should protest. Sridhar Maharaj had said no one should protest. So we could give a little bit of credit to Sridhar Maharaj because he did ask the question, how can the governing body manage the Acharya? The Acharya is supposed to be in direct communion with God. Why would the Acharya need to be governed by a governing body? This doesn't really make sense. And what happens if God dictates to the Acharya one thing and the governing body dictates another thing? Who is he going to accept? Whose authority is he going to accept? So this raised quite an interesting question. But it shows that Srila Maharaj didn't understand the governing body principle. The governing body only works for conditioned souls. A governing body cannot govern a pure devotee. A pure devotee is governed directly by God. He doesn't need a committee to advise and guide him. So, under the Srila Maharaj plan, the GBC devised all kinds of, laws and rules for the Acharya. The Acharya can't do this, Acharya can't do that. If the Acharya steps over the line and deviates, then he can be censured, he can be monitored, he can be suspended, he can be removed, he can be excommunicated, so many things. So all these rules were part of the process which Srila Maharaj helped the GBC put together. We're going to monitor the Acharya and suspend the Acharya and rule over the Acharya. Simultaneously, the same group that's monitoring the Acharya are the Acharyas. So none of this makes any sense. The same people who are monitoring the Acharya are the GBC, and the GBC are simultaneously, so they're wearing both hats. They're wearing the hat of a governing body leader and simultaneously wearing the hat of a Messiah-like individual. They're wearing both hats. So this can't function. And Hansa Duda also admitted this and discussed that with me at length, that this is a big problem with the whole GBC process. They're saying that the Acharya is subordinate to the governing body. This just won't work. But one of the outcomes of this, and the biggest problem with all this, is suppose the Acharya is orchestrating criminal activity, like child molesting, like selling drugs, or so many other crimes that were going on under their regimes. How are you going to control that? Suppose the committee goes to the Acharya and says, hey, look, you have problems going on in your area. We can't allow that. And he just says, well, I'm the Acharya. Nobody can question the Acharya. And that's what Srila Maharaj said also. He says, no one can rule over the Acharya. So it's an unworkable situation. It's dysfunctional. You can't have it both ways. You can't have that these guys are Messiah-like people who are residents of God's planet, on the one hand, and they need to be monitored, censured, and controlled for deviations on the other hand. It just doesn't work, and it hasn't worked, and it won't work. It's never going to work. So it does seem that a lot of my God brothers and God sisters just weren't using a whole lot of common sense, because the GBC, the governing body commission leaders, had been falling down left, right, and center the whole time that Prabhupada was here. We had sannyasis falling down, temple presidents falling down, big leaders falling down. This was happening on a regular, recurring basis. Why would these leaders all of a sudden not be falling down? What magic wand was waved that was going to make them into pure people all of a sudden? So one of the things that was being preached at the time was that these 11 individuals had been empowered by Prabhupada to be pure. So my question was, well, wait a minute, if Prabhupada had the ability to empower someone to become pure, why didn't he empower the whole lot of us? Why didn't he say, I have 5,000 disciples, I'm going to make 5,000 people pure right now, and just snap his fingers and we would all be empowered? And if Prabhupada had the ability to empower people to become pure, why were we having all these fall downs going on? Why didn't he just say, okay, you guys aren't going to fall down anymore because I'm hereby transferring my Guru Shakti over to you, and you now have the power, to be pure. But so this argument didn't really make a lot of sense. But Tamal really carried this to the extent that he was annoying even the other 10 of the gurus, because he started saying, I have the Guru Shakti. I was alone given the real power, the real essence of Prabhupada was transferred to me, and so at one point he was suspended for, making this claim, and it was making the other 10 look like they were being minimized. They were not as advanced as Tamal. So there was like a competition. But anyway, the main problem is no one really explained why would Prabhupada only empower 11 people. That itself doesn't even make a lot of sense. Why would he, if he had the ability to just snap his fingers and people would become pure, why would he just do that with 11 people? And why wouldn't he announce that I'm going to snap my fingers and empower these 11 people? They're no longer going to fall down. They're no longer going to have problems because I'm empowering them to be pure. So this has always been a problem. Now, Pradyumna wrote a letter complaining about the GBC, but mainly he was complaining about some of the technical things like the size of their seed and the size of their worship and stuff like that, which was good. But some of the root issues, like, for example, how could these guys absorb sins like Jesus? That was my question. And why would we offer boga to these people? We're offering food to these people who are conditioned souls. How does that become prasadam? Now later on, Jadharani and Mrigendra and I think Kailash Chandra, a few other people, they wrote a paper and they were complaining about these so-called appointed gurus. And that was one of the points they made, that ISKCON is no longer eating prasadam, Krishna prasadam, which means food offered to God, because if you offer food to conditioned souls, it does not become prasadam. So Jadharani was saying, this is the International Society for Boga Consciousness. But anyway, so this is one of the points. It wasn't just a question of did they have a bigger seed or a littler seed or this type of thing. The question was, how could we modify the entire worship structure that was established by Prabhupada? When did he say we would be changing the whole system of worshiping Krishna as the deity? And didn't he say instead that we should not change the deity worship? Didn't he say that changing the deity worship would be very dangerous for our society? So the whole system of worshiping Krishna became changed. We were now offering to these 11 people, offering them the boga, offering them the disciples. We were offering them everything as if they were Prabhupada, or they were the, replicas of Prabhupada. So this was another thing that they started saying, that when the 11 are assembled together, that's Prabhupada's body. When they're all together, they're the remanifestation of Prabhupada. So all kinds of outrageous claims were being made about the purity of these individuals. But the problem is they were still prone to fall down because, in fact, they had not been empowered to become pure. They were not pure by themselves. So they were just, it was inevitable that all kinds of problems would start to manifest from this group. And that started happening in pretty short order. So anyway, one of the things that began to happen also was that all of these 11, or let's say most of them, began to exhibit very, very opulent lifestyles. They began to ride around in big fancy cars. Some of them had private homes, like Jaitirtha. They rented a home just for him, and in that home he had a bunch of servants. Tamal had, I think, 20 servants or something living with him. Now, the problem at the time was it was very difficult to see the evidence of this so-called appointment. There was supposedly a tape, a transcript, a conversation where Prabhupada said, I am appointing 11 people to be my successors after I'm gone. And these successors will have their own Vyasasan seats. They'll be worshipped as the sum total of the demigods, as acharyas, as diksha gurus. They will have the full capacity of Jesus. They will be able to absorb sins of their followers, just like Jesus is doing, and so on and so forth. So allegedly, Prabhupada had made this declaration somewhere. So I was very cautious because I could see what was developing was a very fanatical atmosphere. Anyone who questioned or even looked like they were questioning this thing was sort of a pariah and a troublemaker and an offender. You were making offenses for challenging the appointment of Prabhupada. So we had to make inquiries kind of on the side and stuff like that because it was a very fanatical atmosphere, not only with my godbrothers, but the new people who were coming in were now being told that Jayatirtha, for example, is your Messiah. You're going to worship him. He's going to take you back to Godhead. He's your eternal link to Krishna. He's, an associate of Krishna. And if you worship him, you will also go back to Krishna with Jayatirtha. So this was being openly preached. Anyone who challenged that or questioned that, especially in public, was denounced and derided and given death stagger stares and all this kind of thing. So it was a very difficult situation. But I did make some inquiries with some of the leaders, like Vichitravirya. I said, Vichitravirya, I really need to see this appointment tape. I need to hear this tape where Prabhupada appoints these people. And I was a little persistent with him, and he just saw me as basically a nuisance. So eventually he gave me some mimeograph paper from India, which was made on that old-fashioned brown paper. It looked like it was 100 years old. And on this little mimeograph paper, there were just a couple sentences which said, they will be the grand disciples of my disciples, or something like that. So I said, this is it? This is the whole explanation Prabhupada gave? Well, no, there's more to it, but, we're not going to present that. So this was very dubious right from the outset. Why would Prabhupada appoint people as his successors and not mention that while he was alive? Why would he not say, okay, I want everybody to be on board with this. I want everyone to understand when I'm gone, I'm appointing 11 successors. He would have made that very clear to us if he was going to do that. But he didn't make this a big public announcement. No one announced this at all until after he left. Just after he left, he appointed successors. Well, when did he appoint them? Well, in May of 1977. Okay, but it's now 1978, and you're telling us that in May there was an appointment, but you didn't say anything about it? So this would be like if a wealthy man dies and then he has 5,000 children, and 11 of those children all of a sudden say, I'm the appointed heir, I'm the successor to the father. And he appointed me to be the administrator of his properties and so on and so forth. Where's the paper, though, that proves that you are the successor or you're the inheritor? There wasn't any. So this was a big problem. There really was no documentation to prove this appointment. It was all just word of mouth, hearsay evidence. But you had to accept it, and if you didn't, you ran into all kinds of trouble, not only with the leaders, but with the godbrothers and godsisters who all became like fanatically involved with this idea, and they began to promote this idea themselves. You need to accept that Jayatirtha is the summum bonum of all the demigods. He's God's Messiah on earth. He's just like Jesus. He can absorb the sins of others, and no one should question this. No one should discuss this. We all just have to go along and promote this, no matter what. So all of the rules that have been made for acharyas, supposedly over the years by the GBC, they say acharyas are voted in, acharyas are voted out, acharyas are monitored, acharyas are censured. for deviations. Acharyas are monitored for deviations. Acharyas are removed for deviations. All these rules would apply to a priest. A priest is voted in, he's voted out, he's censured, he's monitored, these types of things. So they've come, indirectly to our idea that the gurus that they have are conditioned souls. They're not really acharyas. And therefore all of these rules and regulations are required to keep their gurus under control. Unfortunately, this doesn't always work because, as we pointed out previously, what happens if the so-called guru becomes obstinate and just says, I don't want to follow the rules of the GBC because I'm an acharya? So this was called by Dr. J. Stilson Judah antinomianism. Antinomianism means someone thinks he's a pure devotee, someone thinks he's as pure as Jesus, and therefore he's like a lawless person. So antinomianism means lawless in the name of religion. And he told me this personally. He told me this is what happens. And he also said, this is very dangerous. These kinds of people who start these programs of promoting themselves as pure devotees, as pure as Jesus, they create dangerous personality cults. And opposing them can be deadly. And he told me, watch your back. You can be killed by these people. So that's really what has happened. And unfortunately, ISKCON, the Society of ISKCON, has developed a bad reputation because of this program of promoting conditioned souls as absolute authorities. It's creating a fanatical atmosphere, and the public is aware of that. So I would argue that I really don't need to make any written evidence to prove that we need to worship the pure devotee, that we need to offer the disciples to the pure devotee, and we need to offer the bhoga to the pure devotee, and we need to offer the money and the buildings and the property to the pure devotee. I think if there's any proof that that should not be done, someone should show me the written evidence where Prabhupada did not want that to be done. And they should show it to us quick, because we've been waiting for like 40 years for this evidence and we're just not seeing it. All glories to Prabhupada, Hari Bol.